Hello again everyone from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome back to Japan Vintage Camera, where I'm coming to you again from Aoyama Park. It's kind of a nice day here at the park. A little bit chilly, but I'm sitting with my back to the sun, so it feels a little bit more comfortable than it normally does here if it's like cloudy or shady. The park here is quite an interesting place to come out and hang out. It's located right next to the Tokyo National Art Center, which is one of the most famous museums here in Tokyo, and a place where they always have interesting exhibitions. The King Tut exhibition is made stops here, as well as artists like Renoir and others. And also a lot of, I guess, important Japanese artists, fashion designers, and things like that. So there's always something interesting to see here. And also the building itself is quite beautiful. In front of the National Arts Center, we have this kind of little white building, which is what remains of the headquarters of the 3rd Imperial Japanese Army from back in the pre-war days. This used to be a rather large building, shaped something like the Colosseum, a large oval shape with a training ground in the center, but all that remains is this kind of small section here. Before these two buildings were put on this location, this area was the location of the Date residence. Probably none of you really know what I talk about when I say date, but back in the old days, I guess in Japan's Civil War era, when the country was kind of divided into a bunch of small little, I guess, provinces which were constantly fighting with each other, the northernmost province in Japan, where Sendai is today, was ruled by the Date family. And over time they became the most powerful family in the north of Japan. When the Tokugawa shoguns eventually took control of the entire country and moved their capital here to Tokyo, they required that the families around Japan build households in the Tokyo area and spend a lot of money to maintain these households, and also to keep members of their families living in these households, keeping them pretty much hostages of the shogun and the shogun's government. This was the location of the Date residence, and it was quite a large one compared to other ones around the city because of the importance and the wealth of the Date family. I think they were probably the second most wealthy family in Japan in those days, after the Mori family, which was located in the west part of the country. So it's kind of an interesting place to make a video about cameras. The former Date family estate, which then became the headquarters for the 3rd Imperial Japanese Army, which then became home to the National Arts Center and Aoyama Park. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started with the subject of today's video. And today I'm going to be talking about the Petri Racer 35mm rangefinder camera. For those of you who are new to my channel, I sell vintage Japanese cameras in my online store, japanvintagecamera.com. I have an Etsy store, which is also called Japan Vintage Camera. If you'd like to buy this Petri or another vintage Japanese camera or a non-Japanese camera, please visit one of my stores. I'll post links to my stores in the description below the video. So the Petri Racer was a kind of interesting camera. It was kind of a compact version of Petri's Pro 7 camera, which was kind of an odd version of the regular Petri 7 rangefinder camera of the mid-1960s. The Petri Racer came out in 1966, and it's kind of interesting that they chose the name Racer because this was the era when I guess everything automotive or having to do with cars and racing and stuff was very famous. We had the introduction of the Mustang and new models of cars, not only in America but also in Japan and Europe. We had the racing events, which were very popular. The 24 Hours of Le Mans was a very contested race in 1966. Auto racing was becoming popular here in Japan. And a lot of the design of things made in Japan in those days were influenced by the automotive industry, and the Petri Racer camera was kind of one of those things which had that influence. And I guess racing events and things like that were quite popular subjects for photographers in those days. And here you see kind of like the influence of all this put into something as simple as a film rangefinder camera. So let's go ahead and take a look at the features, controls, and functions of the Petri Racer. And starting at the top here, we can kind of see this interesting design here. We have kind of a mix of curves and straight edges, and pretty much a very unique design compared to what other companies were making at the time. I don't think anyone else made cameras which came anywhere close to resembling the Petri. I guess Taron made some kind of odd-looking cameras, and the Lord company did too, but they were not as popular as the Petris. On the top of the camera here, we have this kind of line here that goes along the top and down the sides. And this is kind of looks like the clamshell design, which was popular in the Canon Demi and which Ricoh began using around this time in their more compact cameras. This isn't actually a clamshell design for the body like those cameras, which was kind of considered cutting-edge technology. This kind of I guess a faux line, kind of just a decorative thing to make it look like it was that. But despite the fact that it wasn't that kind of construction, this is actually a very well-made camera. We have the film rewind knob here, which pops out, and we have an arrow showing which way to turn it. We have a nice roller tip, which makes it easier to turn. We have a shoe for mounting a flash gun on the camera, and you can use an old bulb flash if you're one of those people who likes flash photography. You can use a modern strobe flash on this camera very easily. Just follow the directions which are shown on the flash itself. Over here we have this kind of plastic panel here, which looks a little bit like the window system which we have on the rangefinder cameras, which have a meter readout on the top. But this is kind of also kind of a faux meter kind of thing here. This is merely just an instruction showing what to look for when you're looking at the actual light meter, which is visible when you're looking through the viewfinder. On the front here we have this chrome thing here, which is not a shutter button. The shutter button on this camera is located on the front. This is actually the location for attaching a cable release. So obviously this camera will accept a standard cable release. And here we have the film counter window. When we move to the back of the camera, we have this really cool winding lever, which looks kind of like the tail of a fish. The design is actually very good, easy to grip, and easy to catch with your thumb to lift it off of the camera and wind. Over here we have the viewfinder window. The viewfinder window on this looks a little bit small, but this camera actually has an excellent viewfinder rangefinder system. It's very clear. It has projected bright line frame lines, which are superior to what we see in a lot of the other cameras of the time. Though they don't have parallax correction, the green tint on the glass and the design of the rangefinder itself makes for very accurate focusing and a very high contrast rangefinder patch. So this camera is going to be probably easier to focus than, say, similar Minolta or other cameras that were made around this time. As I mentioned before, the light meter readout is visible inside the camera. This camera has a coupled CDS light meter, which is battery powered. And what I mean by coupled light meter is when you're looking at through the viewfinder, the light meter needle moves up and down like so as you move the aperture or shutter speed rings. And what you want to do is move these rings to the combination which gives you the effect that you're trying to get, and while keeping the meter needle lined up dead center. So by moving the shutter speed up or down, the meter will move up or down. By moving the aperture ring left or right, the meter will move up and down. So as you move up in shutter speeds, you have to open up the aperture. As you move down in shutter speeds, you have to close down the aperture. And if you get the right combination, you can use a large combination of shutter and aperture ranges to get the meter needle in the center. So you can either choose a setting which gives you a lot of depth of field or a shallow depth of field and still get a good exposure. So a pretty good system and not that difficult to use once you get used to it. Moving to the front of the camera, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. As I mentioned before, this one has a green window here on the front of the rangefinder window and the frame lines, and as I said before, that really improves the contrast for the focus. And of course here we have the viewfinder window. Moving to here, we have the shutter release button, and this was kind of designed to and put in this location to reduce camera movement when you're depressing the shutter button, which should reduce the movement of the camera and decrease any blur that you might get on the image. On the top here, sometimes if you're pushing quickly, you can kind of move the camera as you see there. This one here, it kind of comes back at a 45-degree angle. It doesn't go down. It comes kind of downward and backward, and this is supposed to decrease camera shake when you take a photograph and give you a sharper image. On the other side here we have the focusing tab, which is knurled and allows for a really good grip. We have a focusing scale here, which is arranged in both meters and feet. In front of that we have the aperture ring here, and this is really cool. This is one of the things which sets Petri apart from other makers. This is a really cool knurled design, which is easy to grip and makes the camera look really interesting. I guess the looks aren't so important when it comes to the operation of cameras, but for Petri and in the 60s in general, especially 1966, 1967, fashion was a big thing in those days, and so this was considered something which might help, a fashion, I guess, modification which would help sell cameras. In front of that we have the shutter speed ring, and this camera features a shutter with a full range of speeds from bulb in 1 second all the way up to 1/500th of a second. It works just like the same type of shutter you would find in the higher quality cameras, like say the Konica Minolta, Pentax, or whatever kind of cameras at the time. Right here we have the self-timer lever, and one thing that I find difficult about this camera is the way that I normally handle a camera and select the shutter speeds. I tend to always bump into the self-timer lever, moving it up, and if I move it up, then I kind of have to wait for the self-timer to go down to take a photo. So if you're operating one of these cameras, be careful how you turn the ring so you don't accidentally wind up the self-timer. It's kind of annoying when that happens. Below that here we have the switch for switching to the X-Sync speed. 99.9% of us will never use this, and I never bother to use it. If you're going to use a flash on this camera, you're probably going to be using a strobe flash, so this is kind of irrelevant because you can use a strobe flash at any aperture or shutter speed setting on this camera. On the bottom here we have this black tab, and this is what you use to adjust the film speed in the camera. And this camera has a range of film speeds from ASA 25 to ASA 800, which is perfectly suitable for the modern film we have available today. Nowadays it's not easy for us to get like 1600 or 3200 or 6400 speed film. We're pretty much just limited into anywhere from 50 to 400 for the most part. But if you're using a handheld light meter or a smartphone app, then you can use pretty much any film speed you like. These don't have any limits on them. On the front here we have the light meter cell, which is located off center, which is another one of those kind of design quirks which Petri enjoyed. And not only is this set off center, but if you look closely at it, this kind of eye, the glass eye which covers the light meter cell, is faceted like a diamond or something like that, and it gives it a really cool look, interesting style. We have the lens here, and this is the 45mm f1.8 Orticore lens, which is actually a quite good performer. I've looked at a lot of photos on the web which were taken by the Petri Racer cameras, and I really like the quality. They have a good contrast, good sharpness, and they render colors very well. Petri always kind of called their lenses color-corrected lenses, and because that was a kind of a big marketing thing in those days, and I guess the lens coatings were kind of designed to bring the best out of color film. For myself, I don't see any difference between a color-corrected lens and a standard lens. I think it's just kind of just one of those kind of marketing things which we still see in cameras and other technology stuff today. A good thing about this camera is that the front lens element is easily removed, and this is actually a wonderful feature if you get one of these old cameras where the shutter is stuck, which is probably going to be most of them nowadays, or the aperture blade isn't turning. More than likely oil has gotten into the shutter blades and aperture blades, and you can simply remove this out by using a tool to grab the notches. There's one on either end of this ring around the lens, and just take out the entire lens element, and then you can kind of clean off the shutter blades and aperture blades with a cotton swab with paint thinner or acetone or lighter fluid or something like that. If you get one of these cameras and the aperture ring isn't turning, please don't force it, because that will easily break the aperture blades on the inside of the camera. Remove the front lens element and open the shutter on B if it'll open. Usually a drop of some kind of solvent on the shutter blades, and you push the shutter button, the shutter will then pop open because the thinner will dissolve the stuff which is making the shutter stick. And when the shutter is open, then you can do the same thing to the aperture blades on the inside. And it only takes about 10 or 15 minutes to get one of these cameras, if it's frozen, to get it working again. Another issue, some issues these cameras have, the first issue is with the light meter, which very seldom works in these cameras, and unfortunately it doesn't work on this one. I don't see that as a very big issue because the light meters in these cameras weren't especially accurate, and you're going to get much better results if you are using a handheld light meter or a smartphone light meter app. The issue is that the mercury batteries in these, as they are gassing out, they gas out acetic acid gas, which is not very nice to solder joints or copper wiring, and the connections tend to get corroded or disconnected on the insides of the camera. And you can see the bottom cover here is a little bit discolored because of the gassing of the battery. When I removed the original battery from this camera, and it had an old MR9 mercury battery, the inside of the battery chamber was actually clean, but certain parts of it are not very resistant to this acetic acid gas which comes from the mercury batteries. It's not an issue that we have with modern alkaline batteries or say wine cell type batteries. If you're lucky enough to find one of these cameras which works, make sure when you store it not to leave the battery in it, especially if you, like alkaline batteries, they don't put out the gassing that the old mercury batteries do, but they do corrode, as anyone who leaves your batteries in your remote control for too long can find out. Another issue these cameras sometimes have is separation of the rear lens elements. These have like a bonded rear element that's two pieces of glass which are glued together, and sometimes this glue becomes discolored, or exposure to heat and cold causes a gap to develop between the two lenses, and then haze develops between this gap. If it's really minor, it doesn't really have much of it or any effect on the quality of the images, but in most cases when I see it, it's quite serious. And I'm kind of trying to work out a system to rebond lenses together without having like the kind of equipment which is normally necessary for this job, because for one thing, I work out of my home and I don't want to have this, have to buy this kind of stuff and operate it inside, inside my home. But I'm trying to think of like a practical way that I can do this in the kitchen. So the next one of these I find with a separated lens element, I'll go ahead and see what I can do with it. Other than that, there aren't a lot of issues with these cameras. The film loading on the camera is very simple. You just pull down on the lever here on this side. The film door pops open like so. This has a cutout in the bottom, so you kind of push in the film cartridge so it goes through the opening here, and then set it down. Pull the film across the opening here behind the lens, and then feed it into the take-up spool, and simply wind and fire the shutter until the film is pulled across and the holes in the film are being taken up by the teeth on the take-up sprocket. Simply close the film door and then wind and fire the shutter 2 or 3 times, and that should get you to the number 1 on the film counter, and the camera is ready to go. But anyway, that's it for my video about the Petri Racer 35mm rangefinder camera. I plan to have this one listed for sale in my online stores shortly, so if you're interested, please go ahead and click on one of the links in the description below the video. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I'm working on making more videos more regularly over the I guess maybe forever if I live that long. And if you'd like to see these, please subscribe. It always helps if you click the like button, and makes it I guess more motivating to publish more videos. So please do that if you like the video. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in again soon.